I think this is going to be a nice hive stand when it's all done. I will put together a video on how I do this at the end and show you how pretty this little habitat area for our bees is going to look when we're done. It's perfect location, south facing, hillside, tree blockage all around. You know, speaking of the birds and the bees, not that we want to get into that subject exactly, but something that I noticed several years ago that made me change directions on how I viewed things completely was a pattern that I feel is going to impact agriculture tremendously, impacting our food supply tremendously. It already has. Since I first started talking about this at the end of 2018, things have changed dramatically. And if you've been following this channel, you've probably been forewarned numerous times about food prices increasing. And I think that in the near term, food prices are just going to continue to go up. A lot of these things are not supply chain issues. They are supply issues, but they're not what I guess we've been taught they are. There are much bigger issues going on. One of those issues is climate. And I've been criticized on this channel a lot because I've said that I disagree with the anthropogenic global warming theory. And the reason why I disagree with it is just science. It doesn't work out in science. Yes, I can concur that emitting greenhouse gases does have some sort of impact on our climate as far as warming goes. But that is limited to a particular degree. It can only do so much warming before it's saturated. And that's the thing that people don't understand, and it's easy for them not to understand it because they see these cars driving everywhere, they see more and more CO2 being pumped out, and so it's easy to instill fear into people, to really make them think that these things are happening. And you know, we can put out a consensus that even has Mickey Mouse's signature on it and say this is a scientific consensus, and people will believe it. They're going to buy into it. But I noticed something that I had learned about as a kid, learned about, you know, in science class even. I mean, this is a proven science. We know that it's there. But what this does, the impact that it has on our climate is so much more severe. And I've seen and documented over the last couple of years that impact on our channel and discussed it with you guys. And I think, you know, back in 2018, 2019, we saw the stratosphere cool to the coldest temperatures on satellite record, which is a little bit different than the global warming theory, the theories that these people are putting out there. And lately you've noticed that a lot of them have been silent on some of the weather events that we've been seeing. And that's because they don't quite know how to explain it or twist it. For example, nobody's told you that the Arctic, the temperatures in the Arctic are reaching the coldest temperatures on record. They're breaking records right now. The polar vortex is so strong this month in February that we are reaching record cold temperatures up there in the Arctic. And you probably say, well, Charlie, that still doesn't solve the ice issue. And it's not so much about the ice extent, it's the ice thickness. But when you look at the sea ice extent in the Arctic right now, the minimum that we've ever seen was back in 2012. This is 2022. So we haven't broken that minimum in a decade, 10 years. The sea ice that's currently there as we start 2022 is actually what they're calling a 16-year low. Or I'm sorry, it's the 16th lowest year on record of sea ice. Now, if the lowest was in 2012, and most of the low years were either right before or soon thereafter 2012, we have actually backtracked in sea ice, meaning expansion. We've expanded in sea ice by more than a decade. So in the terms of climate science, when we're looking for patterns, you know, it takes about 30 years to really determine a strong climate pattern. A 10-year period would be something that we would consider a cyclical pattern. But in this last decade, the cyclical pattern has showed dramatic cooling in the Arctic. The actual trend is cooling. The actual trend is sea ice growth. Those are facts. You could put it out there to the public and say it's the 16th lowest year on record, and you're not lying. You know, for most people, they're hearing lowest year, another lowest year on record. But what they're not hearing is that it's the 16th. We've just backed up over a decade on sea ice contraction. We're now seeing it expand. They just changed the words that work well with the propaganda that's been pushing out all of these alternative energies and pushing massive billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars into fighting this catastrophe. When in fact, for the past 10 years, the trend in sea ice is expanding and the temperatures are cooling. We are seeing records that have not been seen for 40 years in the Arctic right now as far as temperature. This transcends. The Arctic has a massive impact on weather and our climate in general, down especially throughout North America. When you look at the Great Lakes, for example, the forecasts for the Great Lakes this year were at about 15% ice coverage. We are currently at 37% ice cover on the Great Lakes. There is only one Great Lake that is not above the average, and that one is right in track with the average ice cover. So how did this happen? What happened? Well, it's the extremely cold temperatures that we're seeing in the Arctic that have made their way down across the Great Lakes. We've seen these elongated, not polar vortex breakouts, because the vortex has been very strong the last few winters. And in fact, what we've gotten used to is a strong polar vortex means mild temperatures down in the US. But what we've actually seen is a massive polar vortex that when it gets elongated in more of an oval shape, it has been reaching down over the northeastern part of the United States. And that's where you've been getting some of those exceptionally cold temperatures, blizzards across the Northeast. We've seen a lot of winter activity in the Northeast this year, and it has everything to do with the polar vortex, how cold it is in the Arctic, and the fact that it's been dipping down and just freezing the heck out of the Great Lakes to the point where we have blown through the averages. We have blown through the estimates, the ice estimates for the Great Lakes this year. It is absolutely amazing. It's astonishing. And what's astonishing is that the narrative almost erases the past 10 years of data, unless we hit a record warm. Now this thing that's been impacting the climate isn't the polar vortex itself. It's something much bigger than that. And this thing has actually had a substantial impact on even heat waves across the United States. A lot of people believe that when they hear this theory that the Earth would just be rolling into an ice age and that's that. But what it really does is it kind of changes the patterns on Earth. What you're seeing with the Arctic right now is a pattern change, and it's a pattern change that has enabled the Arctic to maintain its strength, the vortex strength. And as long as that vortex stays strong, the vortex gets colder. It's not necessarily, it has nothing to do with radiation, in other words. It has more to do with the weather patterns on Earth. Another cooling pattern that we've seen in recent years is the La Nina pattern out in the Pacific. It's actually the Pacific itself cooling, causing a different wave of patterns across really across the globe. And La Ninas negatively impact crop production. I said a couple years ago that I thought that crop production was going to start trending down, yields would start trending down. And in reality, when you look at crop yields, we have managed to grow crop yields year over year over year over year for decades upon decades upon decades. But if you look at the records, since 2012, 2014, 2016, that era, we have been declining in our crop yields around the world. Declining, not increasing. And granted, the decline has been very minimal, but we've been declining. It's been blamed on things like COVID. It's been blamed on all these other things. But in reality, we've had two La Ninas back to back. Those have an impact on our abilities to grow crops. We know this, it causes, in South America, it causes droughts. It causes droughts out in the western United States. You've seen those farmers struggle. You've seen the cities struggle for water. I mean, the droughts have been pretty severe. It doesn't matter about how much snowpack is there. If the ground is dry, as soon as that ice melts, it's just running off. And that's the problem that we've had out west, is we have seen this change going on. And the thing that I'm about to tell you about has been impacting those ENSO events, is what we call them, La Nina or El Nino. So something happened back there 2012 to 2016. Something happened to our climate that has caused a shift in this pattern, a shift that's going to impact yields, crop growth. It's a shift that's going to impact the weather, and it's a shift that as it continues on this trend, this path, it creates these cycles within our climate, our Earth, our system, that actually have a different pattern than what we've been experiencing for the last 10 decades. And that is a cooling pattern. It is the warming pattern and the increase of CO2 that we were able to see that massive growth in crop growth. Now, what's interesting about that is the need for food, our population globally, expands year over year over year over year over year. And so our need for food is constantly growing. So it doesn't actually, even if crop yields just leveled off and stopped increasing, and our crop sizes just leveled off, the demand would continue to move higher. And as long as that demand continues to move higher, you begin to have this widening gap in the supply chain availability of that food. And I think that we're really starting to see that today. We're really starting to be impacted by a lot of that today, because since 2012 for some crops, 2014 for others, and 2016 for others, since that time frame, we really have not seen great yields. We haven't seen any yield increases to really write home about, to brag about. We've seen smaller crop sizes, and in some crops they have been dramatically smaller. Coffee, as you know, certain crops in Europe, there's just certain crops that have suffered dramatically. What you're going to hear about on the news are record crops for a particular country. I believe in South America they actually saw an increase in crops for quite some time, but they weren't at full capacity before. Now they're nearing full capacity, and they're starting to have these impacts from these La Nina events the last couple of years that are impacting their yields. And you know, the yields we can't see the same crop size year over year over year. Remember, it has to grow. If it doesn't grow with the demand, then that supply chain gap gets wider and wider and wider. And that's really kind of what we've been seeing for almost a decade now. It's been very slight, started to become more and more obvious as time has gone by, but it's finally getting to that point. So what is this massive factor? What changed in 2012 to 2016 in that time frame that has had such a massive impact on our climate, that's been changing all of these things that will continue to cause problems? It's not CO2. It has nothing to do with CO2. But what it has everything to do with is the big ball of fire up in the sky called the sun. The sun has begun to go through cycle changes that are a part of a longer term change in the sun. It has 11-year cycles, and from those 11-year cycles we can see a lot of these patterns emerge during the minimum periods. La Ninas emerged more frequently during solar minimum periods. The behavior of the Arctic, and there's tons of scientific articles on this, there's been tons of studies being done on this, but you know, following the minimum period 2 years afterwards, we start to see stronger oscillation cycles in the Arctic oscillation. So these are all things that we see the impacts of on that 11-year cycle. But what happens if the sun goes into one of its longer term cycles? They call them grand cycles. I don't know, 70, 100 years, we've been in what they call a grand solar maximum cycle. Now the maximum cycle means that total solar irradiance is increasing. And it's kind of like a buildup, stocking in the bank, you know, especially when you're talking about greenhouse gases warming the planet, they depend on the radiation of the sun, that total solar radiance. The energy, that total solar radiance, also interacts with the magnetic fields of Earth. We talked about heat waves earlier. When the sun weakens, our magnetic field actually weakens with it. There are a lot of studies on this as well. And as our magnetic field weakens, the weather patterns on Earth change. They become more erratic. And so you start seeing stronger storms because you start having this erratic mixture of weather, heat waves, cold waves. All of this has been proven time and time again, and it's just basic science. The sun has such an immense impact on Earth. It is absolutely incredible. It's fascinating. You could read about it for hours, and just like everything else in climate science, you still won't have all the answers. But I think that it is fascinating, and I think that if we pay attention to it, we could be better growers, we could be more productive people, because instead of focusing on things that aren't true or things that aren't actually playing out, I feel like after a certain period of time, a narrative that's not able to prove itself by actually seeing trends without the doctoring of graphs. I feel like after a period of time, people should just drop that narrative and move on to something that does make sense. And everything that I've been telling you in this video is actually happening, and it actually does make sense. And the scary thing is that we have this massive cooling going on up in the Arctic, and it was actually, I mean, we were reaching record cold temperatures up there last year too. We have this ice expansion going on. If this pattern continues for an extended period of time, we've already seen the largest, we're now the 16th lowest year of ice on record in the Arctic. And remember, the lowest was exactly 10 years ago. So we're already, it seems as though the cooling patterns almost happen faster than the warming patterns. When you turn the heat on in your house, or you heat up your house, how long does it take to heat up your house to get it to a comfortable temperature? And then when you turn that heat off, your house will stay warm for a little bit, right? That's the ambient temperature. That's the temperature that's been radiated throughout the home and is radiating off of the gases in the home, anything that is thermal. But then as the temperature starts to drop, it drops and cools substantially faster than it took you to heat up your home. And it's the same principle with our Earth, with our climate. We could, if this solar cycle continues to play out into a grander system, like a grander scale of 11-year cycles that are at minimal levels, and that means that the total solar irradiance at the peak of the cycles remains very low, then the cooling patterns will persist more frequently than the warming patterns. If that happens, the overall trend of temperature on Earth will lean more towards the cooling side. It also means that we could expect our weather to become more and more erratic because as our magnetosphere weakens, that's exactly what's going to happen. But all the signs are there. And for those of you who think that when I've mentioned this time and time again for the last, I don't know how many years, that I'm crazy for thinking that, I would urge you to just go online to the websites that actually research this information and read what they have put out there and open your mind enough to be able to comprehend what the 16th lowest year on record actually means, when the lowest year on record actually was, and what they mean when they say that we're reaching record cold temperatures we haven't seen in over 40 years. When they say that we're reaching record cold temperatures that we haven't seen in satellite history. When they talk about the record strength of the polar vortex. Because up until 2 years ago, when the vortex started becoming really strong, the argument was that global warming was causing a weakening vortex, And that weakening vortex was causing these polar vortex outbreaks into the lower part of the United States. But for the past several years, what we have actually seen is a much stronger polar vortex. And this year, what we've been seeing instead of these polar vortex breakouts is an elongated vortex that's been impacting the northeastern part of North America. So think about that, put the data together and run your brain through that a little bit, and then think about what could happen if this pattern persists for another decade, because that's the bigger question. What happens when we hit 20, 30, 40, 50 with this type of pattern, seeing that it is cooling substantially faster? The Arctic is reaching 40-year record colds. We've actually seen temperatures, just if you go back through the news articles for the last couple winters, we've seen record cold temperatures in areas of North America that have been 100-year records. What does that mean? Are you going to be ready for that? Think about the yield patterns I was talking about, the climbing population, the stagnant yields. What do you think all of that means for society?